Hi, everyone. I'm Sylvia. I'm a fourth-year history major in the college, and I'm so pleased today to introduce Senator Amy Klobuchar, current senior senator from Minnesota and former Democratic presidential candidate. When she was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2006, she became the first woman to represent Minnesota in the U.S. Senate. And since then, she's helped pass legislation to combat the opioid crisis, support local businesses and farms, protect consumers, and expand job opportunities for Americans returning from military service. She's also fought to secure safer elections by funding election infrastructure and by preventing foreign interference in our democracy. Prior to her time in the Senate, Senator Klobuchar headed the largest prosecutor's office in Minnesota as the county attorney of Hennepin County, where she focused on white collar and violent crime. And most recently, she was a Democratic candidate for the US presidency, during which time she advocated for fairer elections, investment in American infrastructure, and a public option for healthcare insurance, just as examples. She also attended the University of Chicago Law School. Senator Klobuchar is known for her ability to work across the aisle to get things done and for her candor and sincerity on the campaign trail, and we are so pleased to have her speak for us today. This conversation will be moderated by IOP Director David Axelrod, who served as a senior advisor to President Obama. So please join me in welcoming David Axelrod and Senator Amy Klobuchar.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And let me say best of luck to you. We're sorry to see you go. We know you're in your final days as an undergrad, but that means you're about to approach your first days as an IOP alum. And we hope to keep the conversation going with you. And Senator, it's good to see you. When we scheduled this, and it had to be delayed once for obvious reasons, when we scheduled this conversation, it was going to be focused on voting and the implications of the COVID-19 virus for this very consequential election that we're going to have in the fall. I still want to talk about that, and we will get to that. But obviously, tragic events intervened in your home community. George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in a gruesome way on video, and it's really prodded the conscience of the nation and created both a crisis and an opportunity in your own community. And I'm interested in just your top line thoughts, not just as the senator, but as someone who for 8 years was the county prosecutor in Hennepin County, where all of this is taking place.
Right. Well, first of all, David, thank you so much for having me. And this moment gives us an opportunity to talk about things that could really change the world. And for all the students and people joining us, thank you. And thank you for all of those that have graduated. I know your graduation probably wasn't exactly what you imagined, but I think the achievement is all important the same. And congratulations, especially to you, Sylvia, and thank you for the introduction. So the world literally watched as George Floyd's life evaporated before our eyes, as David described, in a horrible, horrible way. And for me, as someone that has been involved in law enforcement, it was, I think, all the more horrible. And that's one thing I take away first, is that for those of us that has worked in this area, we have a burden more than ever before, and an obligation to make this better. And I got to be at that memorial, which was beautiful. Reverend Sharpton spoke. I've gotten to meet George Floyd's family, and what they want is justice. And by the way, I will note they also want people to vote. I've really appreciated that they have seen that his legacy can't just be those minutes on that video, that his legacy must be so much bigger than that. So how have we responded? The first is to make sure that this case was charged. The case was originally in the county attorney's office and then was moved over to Keith Ellison, the attorney general, who is a good friend of mine and is very committed to justice in this case. So all 4 officers in this case have been charged. That is going to be key for this family and for our country. Secondly, it's the Minneapolis Police Department itself. I was with Eric Holder actually yesterday on a virtual event in a competing university. And we talked about the fact that during the Obama administration, the Justice Department embarked on 25 pattern and practice investigations where they look at a police department that's having problems from top to bottom and basically enter into agreement and make changes. The Trump administration has done one, a unit of the Springfield, Massachusetts Police Department. And so I have asked with my colleague, Tina Smith, we've gotten 26 senators to join with us to have one of these investigations of this police department. Attorney General Barr was on Face the Nation, and he had never wrote back to us, but he said he didn't think it was warranted in this case. So we are doing that now on a state basis. The governor is embarking on that. We don't really have a choice if the feds won't get involved. So that's happening. On a much bigger note, it's criminal justice reform across the board. And my friends, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris are leading the bill in the Senate. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor that really makes sweeping changes to our criminal justice system. And these things can be done at the local and state levels and as well. Accountability, which means things like changing the standard that we use for what the kind of force an officer can use. Right now it's reasonable, and this changes it to necessary force. It is getting rid of chokeholds, and I worked on that section of the bill. It is changing the standard where you can sue from willful to reckless to make it easier to sue. And then there's a number of things related to transparency, because how are you going to figure out what's going on if you don't even have the data? And it is, if a cop has gotten in trouble right now in our country, they can sometimes move to another police department and there's not even a record of what happened. So it's making that known, as well as making public the data on what these incidences are. And the final is training. And that includes, of course, body cameras and all these things that need to be done. It really was a scourge, not just on the criminal justice system, but our country. And my hope that the legacy of George Floyd will be more than just this case, that the legacy will be sweeping reform. Because if we answer this with silence, we're basically being complicit. If we answer it with dominance, like the president has suggested, we're monsters. But if we answer it with action, then we're doing our jobs.
Let me ask you a question, and I don't mean to jam you on this, because this is a national problem. This is not simply a Minneapolis problem. That's why there's a national movement now, and there are deep implications of this. But you were the county attorney for 8 years. You were elected in the late 90s. It was a time of high crime. You were actually elected on a Get Tough on Crime platform there, which the community was asking for in many ways. But over those 8 years, there were more than a couple of dozen cases involving allegations of police brutality that came before your office. None of the police officers were charged in those cases. This is not unusual. This is what happens all over the country. And I'm just wondering why that is. Why didn't it happen in your office? Why hasn't it happened in other offices around the country?
I think the numbers they were talking to is actually, because the ones that came to our office would be the officer involved shootings and deaths. And the police brutality cases were often handled by the city. I was the county attorney and I didn't represent the police department. I took the cases that came in. And one of the reasons that you don't see these cases brought, and again, you look at fact situations, everyone is different. And oftentimes you'll have a situation where someone is about to take someone's life and an officer shoots that person, or they're going to shoot the officer. There's all kinds of different fact situations. But the point is that in some of the cases we've seen around the country, including another case in Minnesota that wasn't in my jurisdiction, Philando Castile, you'll have cases where you think, well, you should. And that case was charged, but the jury came back not guilty against the officer. So why? Well, some of it is this, and a lot of it is the standard of proof. You need a better way to bring these cases. And when you change it to necessary force instead of reasonable force, it might just sound like wordsmithing of a lawyer, but it will make all the difference for justice. So that's part of it. Another piece of it is way back then, all the cases in most jurisdictions and major ones would go to grand juries, these kinds of cases. The grand jury, we did that with every case. We presented it to a grand jury to see if they thought criminal charges should be brought. And now many prosecutors aren't using that method anymore. And I think that's a good thing. They're making decisions on their own. But I think the major issue, David, is the standard. And that's why you see, not just in Minnesota, but in places around the country, these prosecutions have been far too rare.
You mentioned that Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, took over this case at the request of the governor away from your successor in that office, who assisted in the investigation. But it raises the question as to whether county prosecutors who work day in and day out with police on cases have an inherent conflict of interest, and whether there shouldn't be another authority who is in charge of investigating these kinds of cases so as to remove the county prosecutors from these potential conflicts.
Well, interestingly enough, our state county attorneys association just voted to have all the cases go to the attorney general's office. And part of our bill that we've introduced actually would get grants going so that this can happen. So you can have independent outside prosecutors. I support that, but I also actually experienced this firsthand because there's two stages, of course, investigation and prosecution. And when I was in my job, a previous Minneapolis police chief took those cases. They'd at least had an outside investigation and took them in-house. And I publicly fought him on that. And he ended up taking them in-house. They're no longer there now, but that's what he did. And I think that's just a horrible example of what goes wrong when you not just have the prosecutor who works with them, you're talking about the police investigating their own in the same department, which is why I fought that back then. Other things, by the way, that I did back when I had this job, working with the Innocence Project, because I think we have to all agree that there's institutional racism, and the only way to get at it is systemic racism and systemic change to our system. I actually put in place a new way to do eyewitness identifications. I worked hand in hand with the Innocence Project so you could reduce racial misidentifications. And interesting, a piece of that was not having the police officer who knew who he thought the suspect was show the pictures. And we actually put that in place. Using videotape interrogation, which was that era's version. It was seen as pretty radical back then. Of body cameras now was videotaping interrogations. Minnesota was one of the first states that did it. And I actually debated other prosecutors in other states about why it was a good idea. And I think the bigger picture is reducing sentences, changing things for nonviolent offenders, like the bill we just got done in Washington, drug courts. And one of the things that I was proudest of my record was that we actually reduced African-American incarceration by 12% during the 8 years that I was there. And a lot of this was things regarding sentencing and using alternatives to prison, which I think is really important.
When you ran, I mentioned that it was a time of high crime, and you ran on an anti-crime platform. One of the things that you said was that you would hold judges accountable for lenient sentences. You said it was unacceptable to have so many people who were convicted of drug crimes not go to prison. In retrospect, are there things that you would do differently now? I mean, it seems like the whole country is going through a kind of awakening about these issues. And I imagine that is true for prosecutors as well. And I'm just wondering how Amy Klobuchar of 2020 may differ with the Amy Klobuchar of 1999.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to know is that Minnesota was a pioneer with drug courts. I was a big supporter of using drug courts. And that really was a hallmark of, even when I was running against a more conservative Republican for the job, was keeping those drug courts strong. And I think what I was talking about in that instance was drug crimes that were committed with guns, and then people who were actually selling large quantities of drugs. But I've learned a lot, of course, like everyone does in their jobs. And the first thing is that the system can be wrong. And that means a lot of things. It's why I'm such a big believer in having conviction integrity boards and units within prosecutors' offices. Some prosecutors' offices across the country have started that, as well as sentencing integrity, which hasn't been used as much. What does that do? That allows you to look back at what happened. If a mistake was made with a case, or if a sentence just is not consistent with where it should be right now. Strengthening pardons, allowing that to happen on the state and federal basis, clemency boards, all of that allows us, David, to not just make the changes going forward that we need to make with sentencing, and things like allowing felons to vote and the like, but it also allows us to look backwards. So you're not just closing your eyes to what happened in the past. So that's something that didn't exist when I was a prosecutor that I think would be really important. Doing more when it comes to juveniles and making sure that you're looking at those cases, every single one of them. We tended, again, Hennepin County and Minnesota as a whole we didn't have the death penalty, thank God. We used diversion more for juveniles. But I think that all of the things that get attached to getting a sentence and getting a conviction, we need to look back at right now. And that includes, it's so hard for people to get jobs when they get out. They can't vote in some jurisdictions when they're still on probation, even though they're out of prison. We have not used in many parts of the country rehab and treatment, and certainly mental health courts enough. All of those things, I think we need to step back and make changes. Some of it was going on when I was there, but I think we all know we can do better. And those are some of the things I look at. And then the final thing is just the racism and what we saw. I would try to look at these cases. My best, every single day we get a case where someone would say, we can't win this in front of a jury, so maybe we should plea it out. I'll never forget, there was one involving a guy who was standing in the bus. He was an immigrant, and he was drunk or on drugs or something, but he was just standing on the steps. He wasn't really making trouble, but he wouldn't get off the steps, and he just stared. The bus driver's going, get off the steps. This is all on video. The people on the bus start yelling, hey guy, get off the steps. Finally, this young guy, white guy, stands up, goes up to the front and just says, get off the bus, and pushes him. The guy falls back, all on video, hits the back of his head and dies. And the prosecutor comes to me and says, I don't think we can win this. We should probably let it go with these big discussions about it. And we finally decided, I said, you know what, if this was a white woman with dementia who was standing there, it could happen, right, on the bus stop. And it was a kid of color that went and did that. We would never let it go. Yeah, and so we ended up, I can't remember, we prosecuted it. The judge sort of took it away and gave a sentence to the guy, and he did go to jail for a while. But it is an example of what you have to confront every single day in the system.
Yeah, and it seems like you need to correct for institutional bias in discussions like that.
That's right. Yes, you have to just do it, because there's bias everywhere.
Your city council in Minneapolis, a majority there, support defunding the Minneapolis Police Department. It's not entirely clear what that means, but it has become a rallying cry for people across the country who are tired of the George Floyd stories, and no real response to them. Where do you stand on that, and what needs to happen in Minneapolis relative to public safety to restore trust in the public safety function there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I already mentioned the first thing that needs to happen, which is a full-scale review of the patterns and practices of that department. And funding should be conditioned on those changes. And federal funding, especially, we have the power to do this, to say you're not going to get funding for something unless you ban chokeholds, those kinds of things. We can actually do that. We've done that in so many other areas. Do I favor abolishing the police departments? No. If there's a rape, a domestic abuse case, you're going to need law enforcement investigating these cases or coming to a scene. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, I think part of this sentiment and this anger, which is out there, and I see it in my constituent faces every single day, because they literally cannot believe that public servants did something like this to a man who just literally loved our state. He wasn't from our state, but he told his family, and they told me this, that he liked it there and people were nice to him there. And he decided to stay there for a while. He worked as a security guard, and they did this. And so it is looking at the funding for that police department and thinking, okay, can some of that funding be better spent on mental health? Because honestly, a lot of these police officers are having to be counselors, because like, I remember this, for some reason, I was in Iowa for quite a while last year. And I think
I remember that.
like, was it 64, something like that, beds in the state of Iowa, public health beds for mental health in the entire state. And people would be coming up to me all the time saying, you know, I can't put my kid anywhere, he needs help. So looking at that funding, and then also realizing that just putting more money into police isn't going to solve everything when you've got education system, when you've got housing issues. I remember one of my biggest hard things, and I guess you could call this a lesson in answer to your other question, is you can do as good a job as you want on a case and try to be as just as you can in a case. But if then a kid goes home and doesn't have a house to live in, it's much easier to get back into that cycle of crime. If they don't have a good school to go to, there's not a lot of alternatives out there for them. So it is stepping back and seeing the system that you're not just supposed to convict the guilty, but also protect the innocent. That means within the system, that means the George Floyds of the world, but it also means in how you resolve cases and work with our country as a whole.
If you have questions, please indicate so in the chat box, and folks will tend to that. And we're going to get to them shortly. Your police chief in Minneapolis said yesterday that he is not going to negotiate any longer with the police union because they've been an obstacle to reform. You had a good relationship with the police union. They supported you when you ran, but
Not
all over the
that guy,
country.
not that guy that ran the police union.
No, I understand. There's a new.
He started running it,
guy,
and then they did not support me. No.
But but all over the country, Senator, this is an issue with police unions negotiating barriers to discipline for officers who are accused of excessive force and standing up for them. How much of a problem is that, and what can be done about that?
Well, it's a big problem if you talk to any chief or mayor, and this has got to be part of the reform, and it's got to start at the local level with what the protections are in place, because a bad cop hurts everyone, but it also hurts good cops. And there are a lot of people out there that go into law enforcement for a good reason and do brave things every single day. And when you have these bad cops and they are protected within the system and they get to be reinstated, or they move to a different police department or put back in there, that hurts everyone. And so changing those rules, and that's what Rondo, who is our police chief, and is very well respected. He's African-American, and he actually sued the Minneapolis Police Department at one point because of discrimination himself. And the community's been standing with him through all of this tragedy. That's basically what he's saying, is that he wants to see changes to the way that the city deals with the police department. And I think you're going to see that in a lot of places. That's got to be part of the reform.
You know, there've been, speaking of that, yeah, and he did win a settlement, he and some other officers from the police department,
right,
in that case. There have been, just in the 8 years that you were in office, in local office, there were 122 cases in Minneapolis of police misconduct. The city paid out $5 million in settlements, and it does raise the question as to why they would have to pay out these, large settlements if nothing was wrong, if nothing was done that was wrong. So there's a disconnect between being able to prosecute these people and and suing the city for their actions.
Well, and also I had actually 45 police jurisdictions, including some major ones like Bloomington, where the Mall of America is. And I think looking at getting all this data out there, when we talk about data, this is part of it. And it does show this, as you say, disconnect because of the standards for prosecution, because they are so hard. And the Philando Castile case is an example of that. Again, I was in the Senate at this point, and it was in a neighboring jurisdiction, but they had really good prosecutors on that case. They worked it with the support of the Castile family. And even though this young man, Philando Castile, who was simply worked in a school cafeteria, loved by the kids, and he's stopped by the cop and says, "I've got a concealed carry permit." He's warning him as he's getting it out, and he just gets shot down in his car. The jury came back not guilty with a good prosecutor and everyone doing really the kind of case you'd want to put together. And I think that's a good example of that, why we need to change the standard. It was not necessary force to shoot Philando Castile. And again, there are cases like this in every state in the country.
I have to ask you this before we move on to voting. You ran a very strong campaign for president. When you run for president, either you elevate yourself or you diminish yourself. You definitely elevated yourself.
You really elevate yourself like Barack Obama.
Well, that's the goal. But you also, as a result of that, you rose to the top of names that were mentioned for vice president. Now, Jim Clyburn, for example, the other day, Congressman Clyburn said, I like Amy a lot, but this terrible timing for her relative to this. Do you feel that the timing of all of this essentially takes you out of the VP consideration?
David, I've been consistent on this from the beginning. I am not focusing on vice presidential issues. I haven't talked about them. I really believe that this is Joe Biden's choice. Just as when you were such a close advisor to Barack Obama, this was Barack Obama's choice to choose Joe Biden. And Joe Biden served so well as vice president in so many ways, being a close counselor to the president, being so trustworthy in his understanding of foreign relations, ushering the budget through. I know it's not the answer you want, but
no, it's not the answer I want, but it's the answer I expected, but it's not the answer.
I just think he's going to decide who's on lists. He's going to decide who he picks. And I have not broached it at all in any discussions just because it's up to him.
It's the right answer. It's not the answer I wanted, but it's the right answer. Look, this issue of voting is really related because when you think about all institutional racism and barriers, certainly voter suppression and other techniques that are meant to diminish the impact of voting on the part of African Americans, people of color, is a big part of this. Now we have this added challenge, which is COVID-19 and everything that has forced upon us. We saw a bit of a disaster the other day in Georgia, and I was wondering in the primary there that many worry is a prelude to what might happen in November in more than one state. And I was wondering how you reacted to what happened in Georgia, where people had to wait as long as 7 hours to cast a vote on Tuesday.
I think that the words of an 80-year-old woman will forever remind me of that day. She was in line at 6 a.m. She'd marched with Martin Luther King. She was wearing one of those, not just the mask, she was wearing a plastic covering over her because, of course, she's in such a vulnerable group when it comes to COVID-19. And she said, "I've waited so long to vote, and I've waited for years to vote, and I'm going to vote." This shouldn't be happening in our country today. And it, of course, brings the images of Wisconsin to mind immediately, where you had voters in makeshift masks and garbage bags standing in line in the rain, simply because people were playing politics with their lives. And I always think about the woman in Georgia and the people in the garbage bags on one side of the screen. And then I picture Donald Trump on the other, voting with his the vote by mail ballot that he got from Palm Beach, Florida, in the luxury of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in his slippers. I don't know if he's wearing slippers. I just imagine he was, but that's what we got here. And everyone should be able to have the same ability to vote from home. And that's why I've actually been leading the bill, which is included in the House HEROES Act that passed and is now sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. The bill that would put significant funding, billions of dollars, into our state elections. The pandemic can't be dealt with by Fulton County, Georgia, or by some city in the middle of Vermont. This is a national pandemic. And so the answer is, one, to educate people and make it as easy as possible to get them the envelopes and the postage so they can vote by mail. Making sure that we keep our polling locations open for 20 days ahead of time, so those people that don't necessarily want to vote by mail, it's safer for them to vote. Training a new generation of poll workers, because we cannot rely on some of our seniors to be able to man those polls when in fact they're the most vulnerable when it comes to COVID. So that's what is sitting on McConnell's desk. And I would note Republican governors all over the country in places like New Hampshire and Ohio and Maryland have supported getting this funding, as well as Republican Secretary of State. But it is Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, through the lies that he puts out on Twitter, where he says that there's fraud when it comes to voting by mail. They're the ones that are stopping this right now. And it is on all of us to push to get this through, because he cannot mess around with our very democracy. And that's why we're pushing to get this done.
Yeah, I mean, how do you rate the odds? He also said that he thought that if you had universal mail-in balloting, which is not what you're proposing, what you're proposing is that people have the option of mailing in their ballots.
Yes.
But he has said that, Republicans would never get elected again if that happens. So he has been very transparent about his concern there. How do you rate
I feel like jumping through the Zoom screen right now. I mean, it's a total lie, because some of the states that have a lot of mail-in ballot are like Utah. That is not exactly a blue state, and they're in the high 90s. And a number of, I said, purple states like Colorado, they have a high rate. Arizona has a high rate of mail-in ballot. So it has not been a partisan issue. It is only Trump that is making it a partisan issue. And the public is with us. In one poll of swing states, 67% of Trump voters wanted the option of voting from home. 67% of Trump voters. We have vast majority of voters as a whole. So the public is with us on this. And that's why we are pushing to get this done in the next few weeks, to get the HEROES Act done so we can get the money out to the states. Roy Plund, who he and I run the Rules Committee, he has publicly said that while he doesn't want to have the standards in place to preempt the states, which I think we should have, he would go for more money. The Republicans and Donald Trump signed $400 million a few months ago already. So this idea that they won't do it is just disproved by the actual facts of what they just did. And so we're going to just keep pushing to get it done.
Two last questions on this. How concerned are you about the integrity of the election? New York Times wrote that while the Russians tried to tamper in a material way with the voting in 2016, they weren't very successful, but that they may try again. But more than that, all these questions that the president himself is raising, and will undoubtedly raise if he isn't successful, about the integrity of the election, is a propaganda windfall for anyone who wants to destabilize our country. That seems like a big concern right now.
And this very well, that at the last election in 2016, we know that Russia, and this is by the Trump intelligence officials, the head of the FBI, the director of national intelligence, they all said that Russia, in a big way, attempted to hack into every state in the country, and then, of course, sent out social media and tried to influence people like that One of my best examples of that, by the way, came out of Illinois. And this woman ended up calling Senator Durbin's office when her picture was shown, an innocent woman. And it was something that was put out on Facebook. And it was her face that they had just taken her image, put it out there. And it said, "Why wait to vote? Don't wait in line." And it was targeted at African-American Facebook pages in swing areas. Don't wait in line. You can text your vote to 90213 or some number. To me, that's a crime. And that's the kind of thing we were seeing. And so what's happened now is we have more backup paper ballots. One of the beauties of, by the way, mail-in ballots is they're paper. And so we're going to have more of a track record of how people vote. But there's still a number of states that do not have backup paper ballots, like the entire state of New Jersey, with their voting equipment. Georgia, actually, that was one of the issues. They had just gotten new equipment, and it's just another example of why we need more poll workers and people that can operate that equipment there in this next coming election. And then we know, in the words of Dan Coates, the former director of intelligence for Donald Trump, that Russia is actually emboldened, that they believe they're going to do it again, or other countries who are not our friends will try to do it again. So all of this is happening while the pandemic is looming above us. And it just means if we're going to invest like we do in our military and security, why wouldn't we invest in our election security? That is the core of our democracy. What are we protecting with our ships and our planes? Well, we're protecting our country and our democracy. And here we have literally a laser-focused attack on our democracy, and we have to protect ourselves from that, whether it's the pandemic or foreign power. So I have advocated and led the way with Senator Langford, who's a conservative Republican, to get the funding for the backup paper ballots. We're continuing to do that, as well as the Honest Ads Act that I had with Senator McCain and Warner, and now with Senator Graham, that would basically tell the social media companies that they've got to have disclaimers and disclosures on every paid ad that someone buys for an issue campaign or a regular campaign. Our laws just literally are not as sophisticated as the bad guys that are trying to ruin our elections. And we've got to come to grips with that. How can you have a system that was set up decades ago in this world of social media? It's impossible, but we have not changed them.
We're going to take some questions, Senator, from students. And the first one is from Monson Ahab Amiri. Monson, can you step up here digitally? There you are.
I see. Oh, that's quite a room you've got going there, Monson. You've got a big background. Nice TV.
Thank you, Senator.
Pretty good.
Thank you. It's Mohsen Amiri. Thank you for doing this, Senator. This is really cool. My question is a simple one. You sort of carved out, I think, a lane for yourself in the Democratic primary as sort of being in the moderate in the center. What do you think?
I didn't just carve it out. It's who I am. But thank you for that analysis. Yes.
My question is, what do you think remains of the progressive left lane after Bernie Sanders is lost this primary season, and to a lesser extent, Senator Elizabeth Warren?
Well, by the way, and I always thought of myself as a proven progressive, because a progressive is someone who's supposed to make progress for people, and that means actually getting things done. So I think we have an incredibly strong progressive movement in this country. And if you don't believe me, look at the marches that we've seen in just the last few weeks. It is there, it is vibrant, and it is the key to us winning this election in November. And one of the things that I thought was great about the way that our presidential campaign ended, not just for me, but for everyone, is that we came together. And that included Bernie and his heartfelt endorsement of Joe Biden. I say heartfelt because, he literally said the words, I'm going to paraphrase him now, but something like, America, we need Joe Biden in the White House. He was very direct about it. And we're always going to have issue differences. We were just talking about some of the differences when it comes to the police departments and things like that. That's going to exist in our party, but there is so much more that unites us than divides us. And all you have to do, and this is when people say, well, why should I vote? I'm like, okay, well, if you're happy with having a president who literally his administration is tear gassing peaceful protesters to be able to clear the way for him to use the Bible as a prop in front of a church, then I guess that's your guy. If that's what you want. If you want to have a president that let this pandemic heat up and didn't do anything about it, despite the warnings he uniquely had over really anyone else early on about what was happening in China, and just let it fester and said it's going to be okay, that he had it under control. And now you've got senior citizens that are basically dying in multiple numbers in assisted living facilities, and there's nowhere to put them. Well, then that's your president. And if you as a student, want to have a president that really hasn't done anything to make it easier for students to pay back their loans, and is boasting about an economy where we have a 13% unemployment rate, well, then that's your president. So I really think when you talk about the progressive movement, it is the heart and blood and lifeblood of our party, and it is going strong. But I think the key to remember is that despite some differences, we came together in a big way with those endorsements. And as I said, when I endorsed Joe Biden, I couldn't think of a more joyful way to end my campaign. I began it in a blizzard in 18-degree weather, which David was there for Barack Obama's announcement. It was even a little colder than his, I think, but we had the blizzard. But I ended in this hot arena in Dallas. And I think a lot of those of us that were in the campaign felt the same way, that this was the right thing to do in the end. So I feel good about the strength of our party. And you see that in the congressional elections in 2018, and you see it how we have been united behind Vice President Biden.
Mohsen, thank you. I'm sorry for mangling your name, the function of old eyes. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Just a quick follow up on that, Senator. It feels like we're in a different moment than we were on March 17th, in that the COVID-19 virus, the economic downturn that was a consequence of it, and now this issue of violence against citizens of color by police officers. This has created a lot of ferment, but on the economic issue, all of it has held up a big lens to inequality in our society, inequity, injustice, and I think. I'm not speaking for these students, they can speak for themselves. There is a real hunger for more than incremental change, for real fundamental change. Elizabeth Warren, you and Elizabeth were on the stage, and you heard her say quite often, talk about bold structural reform. There seems to be more of an appetite for that now, because we've seen 40% of the country lose their jobs, low income people who aren't going to get their jobs back. And, if you were lucky going into these crises, you're probably lucky going through them. And if you were unlucky, you got unluckier. And do you anticipate there'll be
of color, you fared worse too? But yes.
Do you anticipate that there'll be a kind of appetite for big changes come January, and presumably you'd need a Democratic Senate for that, but have things changed because of everything we've faced in the last few months?
First of all, I think that no one has a monopoly on big change, and Elizabeth and I debated this some, as we all did on the stage. And I think the proposals from a number of us, so we had shared proposals pretty much, with a few exceptions when it comes to climate change, of getting to carbon neutral on greenhouse gases in the very near future. That's a big change over what Donald Trump is doing. Immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform. We all shared that. That is a big change. No one's been able to get it done. And I believe with the Democratic Senate, which many are starting to believe for the first time, we can get there, because history is not going to treat these Republicans in the Senate who keep clinging to Donald Trump, including through how he has handled the murder of George Floyd, or how he has handled in his divisive manner when it comes to the pandemic. All of these things make me believe we can take over the Senate. And these things I just mentioned, as well as economic reform and a public option, to me, these are bold changes. They truly are. So my answer to your question is yes. I think people are ready for these bold changes. And as you correctly noted, the pandemic, literally, you can't divorce the pandemic from what we already knew were inequalities and racial disparities. It literally has magnified it to make it more obvious to people. And so, if anything, it just makes people understand it more, as did that horrific video of George Floyd's murder. It makes people understand it more and cry out for change. The way people have marched on the streets and come out in record numbers, people that never marched before. That goes back to the day after Donald Trump's inauguration with the Women's March, but it also continues on today. And so all of that leads me to think that we are going to see that major systemic reform that I think we need.
Syed, can you step up with your question here?
Hi there.
Hi. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, David. I had a question about police reform. I believe that the police union has been a barrier from all that I've read and heard to systemic change, especially when violence is used by police officers. So I was thinking, do you consider it reasonable or feasible that somehow the police union power could be reduced, or that they could be abolished, or how would you approach this?
I think that there is going to be major systemic change with these police unions. One of the more interesting things is that Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, recently came out and endorsed reform to police. Now, remember, that is a union, right? And he was willing to be outspoken, and I'd suggest you look at it. I think it's on their website, about his statement when it comes to that. So you're going to have members of other unions feel very strongly about that. In Minneapolis, just yesterday, a number of police officers, the chief has already been outspoken, but officers, many of whom are well respected, came out and they condemned the conduct of their fellow officers very clearly. You're going to see other officers as well wanting to see change. I always figure if you set these standards, the people that are good officers and went into public service for the good reason, they're going to be able to meet these standards. So for them, it has just been a way of code of conduct, the way people protect each other and they don't say anything has to change, but they will be able to meet some higher standards. And so that's why changing this systemically means big change in Washington, but it also means change on the local level. And Minneapolis just banned chokeholds as well.
Sayed, thank you. Ryan has a question on this issue of voting.
Okay, Ryan.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, David. On this issue of voting and what we saw in Georgia, it's hard not to give in to the notion that the disaster could be intentionally self-inflicted in some way. From your perspective, what can we be doing to prevent partisans from abusing state elections infrastructure to systemically suppress the vote?
Well, the first thing I'd like to do is actually pass laws that make this more fair. And that's what our bill is, which, by the way, is endorsed by Michelle Obama's nonprofit, to the Voto Latino and so many civil rights groups across the country. And the money I already talked about, but what it also does is set some standards. One example is there's 6 states in the country right now where to get a mail-in ballot, you have to have a notary or 2 witnesses. And there's actually a story of someone in a hospital room trying to get a ballot for a primary notarized through a window because they had coronavirus. So you do have some governors who legally can do it, have been waiving some of these things. Cuomo actually waived some things. Some Republican governors have waived some things as well to make it easier to get these ballots. But that's something that you could do nationally as well by setting minimum standards, not micromanaging every election and the equipment, but you would actually be saying, here's some minimum standards. Have your polls open for 20 days in advance if you want to have this money. That's the way we can do it. We do that all the time. That's how we got better drunk driving laws. We said, change your standards on intoxication and then you get the federal highway money. It's the same kind of thing. So that's one way to do it. Another is pressure from citizens on the local level. We should get my mask. Guys, where's that? I'll show you my mask I wore today to the Judiciary Committee just to make the point. Another one is just trying to elect people that matter. And then the other way is just to wear a mask that says vote on it all the time. That's what I'm going to try to do around the Senate. So you can try that. Someone made it for me in New Hampshire that I met. But I just think it's going to be, oh, here's one more thing for especially all the students and your generation on this Zoom call right now. You guys know better than a lot of people how to navigate the internet. And there are states, as I said, that have some complicated laws on how to vote early. You know, put as much passion into this on any search that you do or any online thing or any download of a movie. Imagine everyone figures out how to do this, which you guys uniquely can, to vote immediately the day it opens in the general election, and each state's going to vary, and educate people. And you can literally become your own little hub of voter by sending it to all your friends and getting it down. Of course, there's going to be groups helping on this. LeBron James just signed up to do this, so he might be cooler than me, I don't know. But the point is that you can do this yourself, like right now with your headphones, like I see right now, Ryan, from your computer, you can get this done.
Ryan, thank you. We have two more questions, Senator. We want to get you out on time.
Okay.
The first is from Kashif, who wants to ask you a question about our healthcare system.
Okay. Kashif, I see your name.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, David. Yeah, I'm Kashif. I'm an incoming student at the Harris School of Public Policy. So my question is a continuation of our conversation about the progressive movement. Medicare for All has reached a record high in polling since the coronavirus pandemic first started. Has your stance on healthcare changed given the weaknesses exposed in our system and mass unemployment leading to millions losing health insurance?
Mm-hmm. So I want to make clear, I strongly believe in universal health care for everyone. I just have a little different way to get there, and that's with a public option. And one of my concerns with the proposal that Senator Sanders put forth was just that it would kick a bunch of people off their current health insurance. I still have that concern. It's a lot of Americans that would be kicked off. And I think the best way to do it is to do something that Barack Obama wanted to do from the very beginning. And I think there would be more and more support, as you point out, Kashif, in light of what's been going on right now. And that is a public option. And there's other things you can do as well. You could start expanding Medicare, go down to, say, age 55. That's not going to help you. You somehow look under age 55. But I think the public option would be a good bet. And that's one thing we can do. The other is taking on the cost of pharmaceuticals. And that's something that Bernie and I have actually done together. We've led a number of efforts. We teamed up on a debate once on CNN together on this issue. And that is taking on the pharmaceuticals by doing things like requiring negotiation of prices under Medicare and setting prices to the international average for certain drugs so we can bring them down. It's a good chunk of your healthcare costs are pharmaceuticals, and nothing has been done when it comes to pharmaceuticals. So I think that as we head into these elections, we don't want to lose sight, and I'm so glad you brought this up, of some of these big issues, including mental health care and long-term care, and some of the things that were motivating people, childcare, things that and now more and more we're seeing childcare deserts, food deserts in urban areas and rural areas alike. We don't want to lose sight of these issues. And if you're one of the marchers out there or anyone else that's on the call, we've got to make sure that people are not forgetting this economic justice that's got to be part of the case that we're making as we bring people in. We're going to have to go back to those basics when we get into the fall, because that really motivated a lot of people in 2018, and Donald Trump hasn't done anything to advance the ball when it comes to economic justice for so many people in this country.
Thank you, Kashif. And now a last question, very appropriate question from Prerna. So please step up and.
Hi, Prerna. I like the alliteration in your name there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Senator Klobuchar, I thank you for being here. I can't believe I'm talking to you. So my name is Prerna, and I am a business school student. at Chicago booth. And my question is, you were one of the 2 women on the debate stage until a few months ago.
Yeah.
And at the last election,
I'm having fond memories. Just let me enjoy it for a second. Okay.
So at the last election, Hillary won the popular vote, but still didn't make it. How long do you think it will be until America's ready to see a woman in the White House?
Well, they're going to have to be ready to see a woman in the White House a lot, because Joe Biden has committed to picking a woman as vice president. And I believe he's going to win this election. And that is a big deal. And there's many, many qualified women that could fill that role. So I think that's pretty exciting. I think you may remember during one of the debates, I said, you know, if there wasn't an issue for women on the national stage running for president, we could play a game called Name Your Favorite Woman President or Vice President. And we can't play that game because there's never been one. And I think one of the things that was exciting, I was just actually, before I got on this call talking to Stephanie Shriak at Emily's List, was that literally on the first night of the first debate, remember at the beginning we had 2 debate stages, on that first night, we doubled the number of women that had ever been on the stage for a Democratic primary debate, because there had only been 3 in history. And that continued on. And I think it gave people this understanding that it's not just one monolithic candidate for a woman candidate. We all had different views on things, and we somehow, oh no, debated each other. Big surprise that we didn't agree on everything. I will say that a lot of us had a special bond during the campaign. One of my favorite memories is the Atlanta debate, where it was freezing cold. It was the debate that produced a Saturday Night Live skit for me that showed my bangs were moving, because I had a cold air vent that was freezing that went on the bangs and made them move, but it was hard to explain. But on the breaks, Kamala and I would literally be sitting there together like this, saying to the producers, women do worse when it's so cold. It is freezing in here. And that's one example of about hundreds, but there was a lot of friendships formed during that campaign. And also, I think we set an example for the country, and that will be very helpful for whoever that first woman vice president is, because I believe we're going to win this race. And then it's going to be helpful beyond, because yes, of course, we must have a woman president, and it will happen. And America's shown it. They voted for women for mayor. Look at some of these incredible women mayors and governors who've been rising to the level of leadership that Donald Trump can only imagine in terms of how they've handled the pandemic. Look at what they've done when it comes to the peaceful protests, and then some of the issues that have come out of those protests. Look at how they've handled it compared to Donald Trump. There's no comparison. So I think daily Americans are reminded that women can lead, that women can be everything from police chiefs to astronauts to anchoring the evening news. And that's what makes little girls say, I can do this too one day.
Yeah, it's not just Americans, it's all over the world. We see examples of women who are leading their countries and
Angela Merkel
have had
yes.
great success in dealing with this crisis
New
relative
Zealand.
to.
Yes, yes.
Yes, exactly. So, Prerna, thank you so much for your questions. Senator,
Yeah.
thank you for your generosity. I know this is a busy and difficult time for you, and
Yes.
we so appreciate you. You are the last event of the unusual 2020 IOP speakers series, and we're so pleased that you could be here today. Thank you so much.
David, and thank you for taking all that incredible experience you had with President Obama and carrying on the torch and to these students, which is incredible. You could be doing a lot of things with your life, but you're sharing your experience and wisdom with them, and then allowing other elected leaders like myself to just spend a little time with them as well. So thank you for doing that.
Well, I'm sure you find this to be true, but they're the ones who are supplying the light so often, and that's what makes it so great to be around them. So Thank you all for your questions. Thanks for being here. And Senator, we'll see you down the line.
All right. Thank you. See you, everyone.